space becomes tactical. Space must become an integral part of tactical command and control process, which means that you need to have that information within minutes or even seconds as soon as it comes to targeting. So space must play a role.
Hey Space Watchers, and welcome to our Space Cafe radio series here from Prague. My guest today is General Major Michael Traut, the commander of the German Space Command. And since our last conversation at the 6th Prague Space Security Conference 3 years ago, Germany's role in military space operations has evolved significantly, facing new geopolitical realities, technological challenges, and strategic ambitions. Today, we revisit these topics and explore what has changed, what's emerging, and what still lies ahead of us. General, how are you doing today?
Oh, absolutely fine. So I remember our last meeting 3 years ago, and I thought on the one hand, it was only yesterday. So it feels a little bit like yesterday. On the other hand, it feels 10 years ago because so many things happened in the meantime. Prague, again, this conference having its 8th edition and happening annually right now reflects a very good combination and a different setup from many other conferences like the huge Space Symposium or other events we've been to both to actually during the last couple of years. So it's still nice to have that unique combination of people around here and to intensify partnerships and to open new dialogues with an emphasis to Southeast Asia and Japan and many other countries. What happened in those 3 years? Again, I have to go back really pretty much to the past. 3 years ago, in 2022, German Space Command was not yet an independent command at the second command level of our German Air Force. We were already called German Space Command, but we were actually still a department of our then Center for Air and Space Operations. So the major organizational thing happened that we became an independent command in the Air Force for the whole German Armed Forces on the 1st of April 2023, which was a little more than 2 years ago. And of course, the biggest change actually in our setup and the attitude that we changed from assessing a situation, doing space situational awareness and a little bit of space reconnaissance into emphasizing on space operations actively. So performing space operations for our national defense. Recently, in the last year, Germany has set up a new Joint Operations Command, of which I am entitled to be the National Space Component Commander, which was not the case before. And secondly, at the international level, we joined last year, Germany joined alongside with France and New Zealand, the US-led multinational space operation Olympic Defender, which gave us a great leap forward in terms of how to plan and conduct actively space operation in order to deter and, of course, if necessary, to defend our capabilities. I think these are the biggest evolutions we have made in the last 3 years.
That I would call major milestones.
Yeah, absolutely.
But maybe you can unwrap for the non-military people in our audience, which there are still a few. What does it mean to be part of this command structure? What does it mean for you and to be the space commander then and in charge of how is it played in real world environment?
In a real world environment, if you look at, let's say, an average day of a space commander, we went from just watching situations, which we have been doing for more than about 15 years now with our German Space Situational Awareness Center.
It was the combined operations with the DLR, the German Space Situational
the
Awareness
German
Center.
Space Situational Center is still a combined endeavor with the DLR, the German Aerospace Center, of which the German Space Agency, a rather complex organization, is always in Germany. So this joint endeavor is ongoing and is a very successful partnership between the German Space Agency and now German Space Command. And this Situational Awareness Center is responsible to do everything about space safety, i.e. to prevent accidents, to mitigate the influences of natural effects like solar weather or space weather, and of course to have an eye on space debris and to have an eye on re-entries and potential impacts in the true sense of the word, potential impact on Earth's, our planet's surface. But this didn't follow a certain battle rhythm. A battle rhythm means that we conduct a circular process in a circle of assessing a situation, creating options how to react for it or to react in it, in following military goals. Then of course, evaluate those options against each other to enable the commander, so in that case, my person, to take a proper decision, an informed decision, what we're going to do next or what we should do next to achieve our mission goal, our mission aims. And then, of course, to plan those activities, conduct those activities, and then reassess the situation. So we start our decision-making circle or the OODA loop, observe and decide, act. So there are many names for it, actually. So this is a major difference between having just a situational awareness center, which from time to time creates reports to the higher or to the political leadership, into conducting as a continuous space operation in order to achieve military goal, which is to protect and, if necessary, to defend our national space capabilities.
You pointed just to the national space capabilities, and I was hesitating for a second, as I see, for me, Germany is part of an European defense or of a NATO defense. And I think you agree on that as well. That's not just a national thing. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not only the national thing, since we are integrated, of course, in our defense alliance, which is NATO, and of course our political union, which is the European Union. All our national capabilities provide a part of our common NATO and or European efforts. And this makes, again, the planning and conduct of space operations a little bit more complex. First of all, we have to look after our national capabilities because these are the precondition to be a valuable coalition or alliance partner. And secondly, we have to align that with the activities of our allies and partners. And right now, actually, 3 levels of alignment. So the first level is our national protection, so national security or national defense. The second one is the Operation Olympic Defender, which we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. And the third line is, of course, NATO's defense, and NATO stands towards the space as a warfighting domain, and an operational domain is about to change. And NATO starts to realize that NATO needs a operational command and control entity or structure for space as well, because if NATO had to defend itself in an Article 5 situation, perhaps in Europe, there must be somebody who is going to advise a NATO joint operational commander on his opportunities, strengths, weaknesses, and limitations and threats in space, and how he could achieve effects in space in order to defend ourselves. And this is something NATO is about to develop right now, and we need to align all those activities together, not only in our minds, but in our structures as well. That's not quite trivial, I have to say.
Yeah, and it unfolds an entire discussion about standards and data exchange and things like that. What we don't do today. I like to stay for a few more seconds on more or less the intro part, since you mentioned it perfectly, what has been involved, or not involved, what has been evolved since you have taken commands. What has surprised you most in the past 3 years?
Oh, wow.
Because if I can skip the silence, for me it was the speed. Honestly, the speed of development. Sure, we are driven by the urgency of acting now. And we see it in so many areas like procurement, etc., where we are lacking behind it. But it is the speed of the development, especially on the space side. And there's a very narrow 2 arc-second view that I have. That is interesting to see. But what the question was, but you?
Yeah, well, actually, speed is, for me, a very surprising factor as well. And we try to cope with that speed of development really in a situation where we still try to set up our command. And actually, the gap in development, if I look at the pace of our development, the concepts of setting up a German space command were developed in 2021 and early 22. And I was already in my first first, let's say, 2 years, I was already happy that we do have a concept which invoked a pace until to be fully operational capable in 2027, which at that time was quite fast, quite speedy. What we've seen is that the actual political and military strategic development overtook our ambitious concept, even overtook our ambitious concept right now, and that the level of requirements to us, what to provide, what services to provide, and what leadership to provide are diverging from our concept how to set up and realize the command. And this was for me as well quite surprising. This is actually the same thing. So it has to do something with the speed of development which has overtaken us. And we need to cope, of course, with those developments by changing a lot of our, let's say, old-fashioned ways to plan, to procure, to operate, to organize. We need to be able to become much, much faster in all those respects. This was a big surprise. And I would say the second surprise was the level of acceptance. All of a sudden, space has become in our military and partly even political environment, which really surprised me, for instance, that we now have in Germany a Ministry for Research, Technology and Space, which is the first time in history in Germany that a ministry's name includes the term space. So the importance, the strategic importance of space for our whole society in our modern life is obviously recognized and realized. And the next challenge, of course, is to bring the horsepower to the ground, as we would say in Germany.
I just thought you mean it to bring it to bear as the minister, so it no pun intended here.
No, that's a coincidental.
But it was a good one.
Yes, absolutely.
But let's dismantle a bit of the reason that created the speed, the war in the Ukraine, and let's focus a bit on the lessons and the strategic shifts. So the war in the Ukraine has accelerated the role of space in modern warfare without any doubt. What are the key lessons Germany has drawn, particularly in terms of resilience, situational awareness, and command infrastructure? You partially went into that as well.
Yeah. The first, let's say, lesson was, and this became really obvious and was widely discussed in your channel as well, that commercial space is absolutely crucial for military operations. Why is that? Because there is already a commercial market for space-based services. If you look at space-based imagery, if you look at space-based communication, P&T service, and you realize how valuable P&T services are if they are not there or if they are jammed or interfered with. So commercial space is absolutely crucial for a solid and successful defense posture. What does it mean? We need to include, of course, that commercial space into our defense planning, into our strategic thoughts. And the second issue as well, actually the lesson number 0, if commercial is lesson number 1, lesson number 0 means most probably the coming conflicts start in 2 operational domains, which is space, which is a physical domain, and cyber. And I would even suggest those conflicts are precluded already, because before it comes to a physical, i.e. shooting conflict, those conflicts will be precluded by actions in space and the cyber domain, perhaps because the other side tries to put away a certain advantage from the adversary in terms of information superiority or intelligence superiority. And of course, because actions in space may not be seen so transparently, and actions in space may not be so much attributable to a certain actor. So this is a lesson number 0. Future conflicts may probably begin in space and the cyber domain. Third lesson is, of course, you need to have, and you mentioned it, you have to have some resilience in your whole setup. Resilience does not only mean that you have several systems at hand, but resilience means as well that you are ready to operate under limited or degraded conditions. We contribute a lot of our thoughts into the question how to operate in a space-degraded environment, because we have to survive the first attack in space, and how we actually might circumvent or have workarounds to a limited accessibility of our own space services. And the third thing, of course, and no gladiator would go to the arena only with a shield. So a proper defense and a deterrence, of course, would include the capability to conduct offensive measures as well, because this would deter a potential adversary and make him think twice if he ever would attack you, which is the corner or the core of a successful deterrence. So these are our lessons from the Ukraine. We try to follow a couple of concrete lines from training up to building up redundancies, up to being able to be very responsive in terms of damage or in terms of outages to technical systems, and of course to exercise operations in a space-degraded environment. And of course, we would like to set up a certain offensive capability as well in terms of perhaps if an adversary is able to jam our SATCOM, why are we not able to jam his SATCOM?
So you're not talking about kinetic capabilities, more soft, like jamming, blending, spoofing.
I think it's a good strategic move to keep an adversary a little bit unclear of how you would react. So what we're looking at is a whole spectrum of reversible and even non-reversible measures. That does not necessarily include kinetic measures, but it could.
A forced orbiting is,
let's say, on-orbit maintenance or on-orbit servicing, assisting another satellite to end its life pretty soon. Yeah, something like this would be polite. Yeah.
Absolutely. One question that drives me from what you just mentioned, I see that Germany, the lesson talked about, sees things different, but how has this conflict reshaped Germans' threat perception in space, especially regarding hybrid non-kinetic threats, and what to do with that? Because that's a relevant question.
Absolutely.
The rest is academic, and you're not an academic.
No, I'm a military operator, and I'm pretty fine with that. How is our threat perception changed? I would say fundamentally, because if you look a little bit back in our history, even Germany running a little number of military satellites, and we've been running our satellites for a decade almost, or even more, even approaching 2 decades. So those first constellations or satellites were designed under the assumption that there's no threat to them, no kinetic threat and no interference threat, no RPO, rendezvous proximity operations threat, no threat at all. And this is a great deficiency I have to cope with as being responsible for the security of those satellites nowadays. So I have to think about measures how to protect those legacy satellites and legacy systems as well. Different options for that. But the recent conflicts have shown us that we are under threat in every operational domain, and our potential adversaries are developing very quickly, as it was mentioned at the conference today as well. So look at what happened in Russia, China, and the commercial sector in the last 10 years. And our satellites were designed 10 years ago. So nobody assumed that they would be under threat in any case. So this is a major change. And nowadays, we would never design a space system without taking account of threats against it.
What a perfect segue into the new German space architecture and your future vision. So you recently mentioned work on a new German space architecture. And can you outline what it entails? So from capabilities to governance, question mark?
There are, of course, the conceptual works are still ongoing. So I expect the strategic documents of having a space security strategy, which would be the overarching document for Germany at cabinet level, down to a German military space architecture. This would be a Ministry of Defense paper. So how the German military or the German defense would envisage its space architecture, not only including space segments, but the whole system-wide view, including ground segments, link segments, launch capabilities, and so on and so forth. And what we envisage is to set up in the next coming years with first steps only the next, let's say, 3 to 4 years to have first capabilities in 29 and a complete setup until the end of the next decade is a multi-orbital system, which of course consisting of a larger number of space segments, which makes them more resilient from the outset.
You spoke here about 3-digit.
It could end in a 3-digit number. It's not conceptually fixed so far. I could give you the number which is always true. It's 42, but it's not of big value.
I'm quite sure you wish you had 42.
I wish I had 42 satellites. Yeah. So it's going to be a multi-orbital and multifunctional architecture serving a number of different purposes. First of all, of course, reconnaissance. And we did not come to the point yet that space is becoming more and more tactical. That's another headline we are strongly following up to now. If you look at space capabilities, especially the capabilities in ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, and early warning, those capabilities were in a kind of state in Germany where they contributed to strategic intelligence, saying, okay, I take a picture of a certain object, and it takes time to get that picture at home, to get that picture evaluated and exploited, and then reports are going to be written, and perhaps a week or two later you have proper information about that particular object. So that's not sufficient anymore. Space becomes tactical. Space must become an integral part of tactical command and control process, which means that you need to have that information within minutes or even seconds as soon as it comes to targeting. So space must play a role. We not only need to have a quick reconnaissance capability, we need to have very quick communications to bring that information from the other side of our planet back home and back and forth again for platforms operating somewhere else in the world. And of course, it could be multifunctional. Not every satellite's doing everything, but there might be components of that architecture contributing to precise navigation, contributing to communications, contributing to imagery, contributing to early warning. So there are several architecture design ideas under consideration right now, which we could develop in a stepped approach, of course. Not everything at once and not everything at the same time. Another idea in that architecture are rolling fleets, pretty short-term updates, not creating a satellite with which we designed for 5 years and have written papers for another 3 years before, and building or manufacturing a satellite which is already old when we launch it, and then we operate it. We run it for another 15 years, so that should be the past. So we follow a responsive and a new space setup with that being updated and being augmented with additional capabilities in a kind of rolling setup. So that's basically the idea of our German military space architecture.
Is SSA part of it?
Oh, yes, of course. On-orbit SSA might be a part of it as well. Of course, it can be a part. And every sensor, regardless if it's a terrestrial or an orbital sensor, can be helpful for enhancing our picture.
To what extent is dual-use technology, so civil and military, embedded in your architectural vision?
Again, it comes back to our lesson number 1 from Ukraine. So commercial space is crucial. So we, of course, need the support of a hopefully fast-growing European market in space-based services. And that's actually my hope for the near future, that we manage to create a European market for those services, which could be valuable for commercial customers and commercial space operators, for instance, to do their space safety issues, and of course for the military and defense purposes. So this is a dual use by nature. And I would say that dual use should be a positive sales argument, not a negative attribute anymore. Because if you have a dual use capability, you can sell it to many more customers as if it was only military or only civilian.
I see. I would like to shed a bit of light on the challenges, and here especially the policy challenges. On that front, has there been enough political and societal awareness in Germany to support strategic space investments? Yes, we have our constitution changed for an infinite government spending, but it sounds easier than it is, I assume.
I see a very positive development, actually. Due to the situation, due to the threat, due to the necessities, there have been a lot of political changes, and of course there are political ambitions. There is a completely different setup of resources available. A big challenge might be that in the past, in the last 30 years, we enjoyed the kind of luxury that we had a lot of time, or we thought that we had a lot of time. And of course, that was met by very limited resources. So that led to a culture of, let's say, every euro must be spent as efficiently as possible, which led us to a culture of over and over again scrutinizing on efficiency, leading to lengthy design processes and so on, which sometimes turns into the contrary, actually makes things even more expensive. And the second cultural problem which we need to tackle is a culture of risk avoidance. Because if every euro needs to be spent as efficiently as possible, nobody likes to make a mistake. There's a quote of a political scientist in Germany. I can't tell you the name because it was Chatham House rules but he said, if we do have more problems with our national German audit office, then we fear the Russian armed forces. Yep. We might have a problem. To be honest, that culture of risk avoidance must change to become more flexible, more quickly. And of course, we need to be able to try some things. And if it fails, better fail early and learn from it. Stand up and continue. This is how the commercial sector, especially in the United States, was so successful in the last decade.
Let's shed a light on the allies and the NATO and the vision for a common European capability. Germany, and you mentioned before, is member of the CISPO, also an Olympic defender, and a strong proponent of EU defense collaboration. Has there been meaningful progress towards a common operational space capability in NATO or the EU? And I distinguish between the two. NATO, you shed a bit of light before?
Yes, absolutely. It's a kind of very unique situation of NATO and the EU with regard to space. Normally, we perceive NATO as being the strong military defense alliance, having own capabilities. For instance, in air surveillance or air-to-ground surveillance, NATO is running a fleet of airplanes under the NATO flag and so on. NATO has a command structure which is fairly well distributed and completely standardized, having been there for decades already. So we perceive NATO as being very strong in military terms. And on the other hand, we tend to perceive a EU is not that strong in military terms as well. So in space, the situation is exactly the other way around. EU has been operating own satellite constellation very successfully. Look at Copernicus, look at Galileo. NATO does not own a single satellite. So this is a kind of a paradox situation. We contribute, of course, to both developments. We continue, of course, to support the European efforts in terms of IRIS-Square, for instance. So we do support IRIS-Square from a military operational perspective. And, of course, we support NATO in its first steps to set up a space command structure. Not necessarily that we would encourage NATO in the first place to acquire own space capabilities in terms of hardware. So the best thing for NATO, because NATO has been good at it for decades in terms of standardization, doctrine, command and control, and such things, to encourage NATO just to extend that to the space domain. So we support the Space Center of Excellence, and we support, of course, the recently stood up Combined Force Space Component Command in Ramstein.
So, final question with hopefully a short answer. How much time do we have realistically to get all this right before strategic vulnerabilities become irreversible? And don't say 2029.
Very little time, of course. But if we show that we are absolutely serious on that, this would make us credible and this would extend the time we have. So I think we should have a very strong start into that. And we have to see that Germany has done major steps towards that in terms of budget, in terms of seeing space as strategically important. And we need to keep up that pace. And if we kept up that pace and acquired reasonable and substantial capabilities in short term and show that we have a strong resolve on that, this might even give us some more time because this is already a deterrent.
General Traut, thank you very much for another great, insightful and urgent conversation. I wish you and your team good luck in the command and in all the operations you do. Thank you for your service.
Thank you for giving me the chance, and all the best for your work.
And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.